And I was one of these people that thought I wasn't scared of dying. And I hear this a lot, and perhaps there are people that aren't, but honestly, I feel like everyone is, that it's really wired into our DNA, and that's how we have survived, is through having that fear of death. So, as a species. So fear of death becomes an important part of awakening and something that we need to overcome and work through. And this can take, for some people, years, this part of awakening. So, I think about Ramana Maharshi, meditating on his uncle's death as a teenager, and which is what brought on his awakening. Like, that's how potent this particular topic is, the focus on death and working through our mortality. That's how crucial it is for awakening. So monks have been meditating on death and going to morgues and that type of thing for many years as a practice, for a reason, because this is a very important part of awakening, to face this fear. So I would say the fear of death we break on a psychological level at this part of awakening. There is still a part of the body that remains scared of death, and I think that's a good thing. I think that keeps us safe. It keeps us, the body, operating in a conditioned way that keeps us safe, so that we're not walking in the middle of the road or doing things that are dangerous. So that's not the part that I'm talking about. I'm talking about in the psyche, how we have this fear of death that we might not even know is there. So some of us have not accessed it yet. And it took me a long time to access this. I really didn't think that I had it. I had to face death many times in my life. I had a very challenging life and so many dramatic things happening where I was on the edge of death. And so I really just thought, well, I don't have it because I've faced it so many times, which makes sense. But I did have it. Once I went deep, started going deeper into the layers of fear to do with awakening, then I started to notice, well, I do have a fear of death, and it wasn't very strong. So it doesn't have to be very loud, but there's probably some fear there for sure. That when the time comes and you're actually having to face, trying to fight for your survival, you'll realize, wow, I actually am quite scared of this. And that's to be expected. That's quite normal to be accessing that. It's just we've really buried that down, I think, as a species. We really don't want to think about death. And although we know it's inevitable, we've really just put that in our blind spot. And so we really feel like it's not there. So I understand that it can feel like there's no fear of death there, but if you do something like bungee jumping or skydiving or whatever, sometimes you can sort of realize, oh, okay, it actually is there. When I do the right task, it's just because my day doesn't really put me in a position where I feel fearful of death. So it's not like we're trying to bring it on, but we're just trying to see, is it buried in here somewhere, which is likely that it is. And we want to start to dig into that, go towards that. And the thing that happens when we start to face on our mortality, what life will do is give us opportunities to face this when the timing is right. So now I'd say with my awakening, this happened about a year before I had the big awakening shift that everyone talks about. It was about a year before. I'd had no fear up until that point. I'd had no fear of anything at all. And then a year before was my first taste of existential fear. And it started as a fear of death. And it just felt like every show that I watched was about someone dying of some terrible disease. And everywhere I drove, it seemed to be that there were gravestones. And it was just constantly brought to my attention. I would dream about dying. I would have it just became like such a focus that I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Life kept showing me. And I find this happens quite commonly when I work with clients, that they'll get to this point where this wants to be faced. And so they might get a difficult diagnosis, or a family member might die, or they might get in a near miss, or they might have near-death experience, something along those lines will happen, and it brings it up front and center, this fear of death. And when we start to really go through it and face it and realize how much is there, just by feeling it, it's all we can really do with this is just to feel like, wow, this fear of death is really activated here, and I'm going to die. I'm going to die, and I don't know when. And you're just feeling what was already there. What was already there. It's giving you an opportunity to face what was already there. And life will allow that to happen in some magical but probably painful way. And the deeper you go into this is a real teaching to go into this fear. So I would say don't avoid it if you're in a position where this is coming up for you. This is a portal. This is an opportunity to go into this, just like Ramana Maharshi did. And so I would say if you've done the work around the traumas that you have around fear specifically, at least to some degree, or you've got some support with that so that you can go and get help if you're too activated, then you can start going towards this fear of death. And I would say start meditating on death, start imagining yourself as dead. What would that feel like? Picture yourself at your funeral in the coffin. And I would play like funeral music and sort of lie like this and like really try my best to just imagine what it would be like for all of this to be over, that I'm never going to have another thought. I'm never going to do another thing. This character story is completely over, and try and imagine it as best you can. Try and make it as real as you can. And that can really help to start to access this fear of death that's so important, because we're really trying to break through to having a realization. And you might have your own sort of variations of this, but this is just a pointer. But we're basically trying to establish that one is that this body will die. That is true. That is absolutely true. And facing that fact, because that's truth. Anything that's true wants to be faced. It wants to be seen. So, okay, I am going to die. I am going to die, and I'm scared. Okay, everyone is going to die. That's scary. Okay. And when we go deeper into it, we start to realize, but what I am essentially is actually eternal. And the way that I saw this was in a dream. And this was a few weeks before I had that awakening shift. And it was that I was in a boat, and my greatest fear in this life was great white sharks. Being an Australian and growing up in Perth, I was scared of sharks. And I was out on the boat in the middle of the ocean with great white sharks circling. And my awakening teachers and mentors were on the boat, and they didn't say anything, but they were just sort of nodding, like, you know what you need to do. And I knew I had to feed myself to the sharks, and I had to do it myself. I had to willingly do this in the dream. And so of course I thought it was real because it was a dream. And I was screaming, I was hysterical, like I was so scared. But I still did it anyway. I knew I have to do this. I just know that I have to do this. And I just fed my head off the back of the boat, and it was immediately consumed by a shark. And in that moment where the jaws shut, I dropped into complete formlessness and realized I'm eternal. And so it was such a relief. It was just like, oh, that was just a story. I can't get hurt. It was like, oh, wow, what a relief. I mean, terrifying, but what a relief. And so then in that dream, I had the realization I'm eternal. So as I've spoken about before, knowing something conceptually like that we're eternal versus having a realization of it, like that experience as an example, is very different. Awakening is about having those realizations, having those awakening experiences, so we know directly through our own experience what is true, not what someone is teaching us. So I can say, yes, this whole death part is about you understanding your eternal nature, and that's great. But it's a matter of going through the process and finding your way with it so that you have that realization yourself. So I would say make death the focus if this is resonating with you, and meditate on death and watch movies about death and really contemplate it. Like, wow, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. Maybe go and help out with people that are dying. Really, really get the paradox of it. That we're going to die, and that we also really were never born and can't really die. And that paradox of our eternal nature. So that's a really important part to all of this existential fear. And when we have that realization that I am eternal, it soothes a lot of the existential fear. So if you can bring that on in some way, then I would very strongly suggest to do it, because it's going to make the rest of the fear a lot easier.